The ceasefire that Donald Trump has been loudly advertising to the American public and the world is, in the most precise analytical sense, not a ceasefire at all. It is a strategic pause imposed not by American diplomatic brilliance, not by the success of 40 days of aerial bombardment, and certainly not by the devastation of Iranian military capability that Trump continues to describe in terms so disconnected from observable reality that one genuinely wonders whether his advisors are feeding him information or simply feeding him fiction. The pause exists because the geography of the Persian Gulf, the theology of Islam, the cold calculations of Gulf monarchies, and the quietly shifting alignments of Eurasian powers have collectively placed a series of walls around American military options that no amount of presidential bluster can dissolve. Understanding how those walls were built, who built them, and what their existence means for the broader strategic trajectory of this confrontation is what this analysis is about. And what emerges from that understanding is considerably more alarming than anything the mainstream media has thus far been willing to articulate. Let us begin with the dimension that has received almost no serious attention in Western commentary, and that is the Hajj. At this precise moment in the calendar, somewhere between 2 and 3 million Muslim pilgrims, both Sunni and Shia, are converging on Mecca for one of the most sacred observances in the Islamic world. The commemoration began on the 24th of this month and extends through approximately the 31st, with Eid al-Adha falling in the middle of that window. This is not merely a logistical inconvenience for American military planners. It is a geopolitical fact of the first order because it places Saudi Arabia in an extraordinarily exposed position should it be seen as facilitating, even passively, any American military action against a Muslim nation during the holiest of Islamic pilgrimages. The Saudis have made this unmistakably clear in private diplomatic communications. The United States has already been told, in terms that admit no ambiguity, that Saudi airspace and Saudi territory will not serve as a launching pad for American offensive operations. Indeed, information reaching informed observers suggests that American air refueling activities have been shifted entirely to Iraqi airspace, a relocation that is far more than a minor administrative adjustment. It is a confession of strategic vulnerability. To understand why that vulnerability is so profound, one needs to spend a moment with the basic operational geometry of American air power in this theater. The F-35 fighters that constitute the cutting edge of American strike capability in the region are not based in Saudi Arabia. They are positioned in Jordan, at the Muwafaq Salti Air Base, and in Israel. From those locations, the distance to Prince Sultan Air Base just outside Riyadh is approximately 820 miles. The distance to Kuwait City is roughly 720 miles. The operational range of the F-35 without aerial refueling is approximately 550 miles. This means that these aircraft cannot even reach the eastern portions of Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, let alone the Iranian interior, without being refueled at least once before they arrive in the operational zone, and they will require refueling again to prosecute their missions and return safely. The tanker aircraft that perform this function are not dealing with one or two planes. They are managing dozens of sorties simultaneously in airspace that is contested and potentially threatened, threading enormous and relatively vulnerable aircraft through corridors that the withdrawal of Saudi cooperation has now made considerably more narrow and exposed. What this means in practice is that the loss of Saudi facilitation does not merely complicate the American military campaign against Iran, it transforms the entire logistical architecture of that campaign from something manageable into something genuinely precarious. The corridor through Iraq that now substitutes for Saudi airspace creates its own set of problems. Iraq's government has not consented to being used as a transit route for American strikes on its eastern neighbor. Baghdad has its own complex relationships with Tehran, its own Shia political constituencies, its own sovereign dignity to consider. Forcing operations through Iraqi airspace over Iraqi objections is not simply a military inconvenience. It is a political provocation that deepens the regional isolation of the American position with every sortie flown. And if one needs a concrete illustration of how the Saudi decision actually materialized, consider what happened to what was being called Operation Freedom 3 weeks ago. Trump announced a pause in that operation. The reality, as people close to the situation have since confirmed, is rather different. The Saudis pulled the plug. Trump did not pause. He was stopped. The gap between those two descriptions is the gap between an administration managing events and an administration being managed by them. But this is where the situation becomes far more consequential than the merely operational, because the Saudi decision is not simply a tactical adjustment driven by the timing of the Hajj. It reflects a fundamental strategic reassessment that has been building across all of the Gulf Cooperation Council states since the first phase of this conflict revealed that the foundational premises of American war planning were catastrophically wrong. The United States went into this confrontation with Iran operating on a specific theory, one shared with and enthusiastically endorsed by the Gulf monarchies, which was that a sufficiently intense campaign of strikes against Iranian command and control, against the leadership of the Islamic Republic, would trigger the internal collapse of the regime. The population, long presumed to be chafing under theocratic rule, would rise. The Revolutionary Guards would fracture. The supreme leadership would be decapitated or would flee. The Islamic Republic would simply dissolve, and the strategic landscape of the entire Middle East would be redrawn in a matter of weeks. The Saudis, the Qataris, and the Kuwaitis bought into this vision. They provided facilities, overflight rights, logistical support, and what amounts in legal terms to material facilitation of a military campaign that was sold to them as a clean, swift, decisive solution to a problem that had been disturbing their sleep for decades. It did not work. Not only did it not work, but the failure of the decapitation strategy left the Gulf states in a position they had not anticipated and had not prepared for. They were now identifiable as accomplices. Iran knew who had helped. Iran had the means to respond, and the damage that followed was not hypothetical or symbolic. Qatar suffered the most severe infrastructure destruction of any of the 5 affected GCC states. Its helium production capacity, which had represented approximately 44% of global supply, was severely curtailed or destroyed. Its liquefied natural gas export facility, which had been accounting for something in the range of 10% of global LNG supply, sustained significant damage. The Saudis avoided the worst of the direct infrastructure strikes, but their ability to export oil through the Persian Gulf was effectively suspended. Bahrain, which has received far less attention than it deserves in Western reporting, was by some accounts very nearly destroyed as a functioning state infrastructure. These are not the outcomes that were promised when Gulf leaders were being told by American officials that the operation would be clean, surgical, and conclusive. What happened next was, in retrospect, entirely predictable to anyone who has studied the history of how smaller states recalibrate their alignments when a great power patron fails them at the moment of maximum exposure. China and Russia had never been entirely absent from the diplomatic background of this crisis, but they now stepped forward with something concrete. They offered a new security architecture, one that would bring Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the remaining Gulf states into a framework of mutual security guarantees that did not depend on American promises, American bases, or American military action. The offer was, at its core, a recognition that the countries of the Persian Gulf littoral had more to gain from a regional security arrangement that included their most powerful neighbor than from continued subordination to a distant patron that had just demonstrated, at enormous cost to them, that it could neither win the war it started nor protect the partners it had recruited. Russia and China were not offering charity. They were offering a business proposition grounded in the observable facts of the new strategic balance. This shift in Gulf thinking is not yet complete, and it would be a mistake to describe it as irreversible. But the trajectory is unmistakable, and it is being accelerated by every day that the American military position in the region deteriorates. The United States finds itself in the extraordinary position of having initiated a major military conflict, sustained 40 days of intensive air operations, spent enormous quantities of ordnance and political capital, and emerged with its strategic position in the Middle East weaker than it was the day the first bomb fell. The Gulf states are not hostile to the United States in any ideological sense. They are simply rational actors who have watched a key assumption, the assumption of American military decisiveness, collapse in real time, and are drawing the conclusions that rational actors draw. And what makes this moment even more significant is what is still unfolding in the background, because the full strategic implications of what has happened here extend far beyond the immediate military theater. Consider the naval dimension of this confrontation, because it illuminates with great clarity the gap between American political rhetoric and operational military reality. Trump has claimed, repeatedly and with apparent sincerity, that the American military has effectively destroyed the Iranian Navy. This claim has been examined by people who know something about naval warfare, and their assessment is not kind. The Iranian naval force is not, and has never claimed to be, a blue water offensive navy in the tradition of the American carrier strike groups. It is a coastal defense force, a force specifically designed and equipped to deny an adversary the use of the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. It consists of submarines, underwater drones, surface drones, fast attack craft, the Baghamar-type vessels equipped with anti-ship missiles, coastal defense cruise missiles, short-range ballistic missiles, and aerial drone swarms. This is not a navy you sink with carrier strikes. It is a distributed, redundant, shore-based and shallow water system designed specifically to make the Strait of Hormuz impassable to hostile surface forces. Destroying some of those fast boats does not destroy the system any more than destroying some of the arrows in a quiver destroys the archer. The testimony before Congress by Admiral Daryl Cottle deserves more attention than it has received. When asked directly about the possibility of mine-clearing operations in the Strait of Hormuz or escort operations for commercial shipping, the Admiral's answer was refreshingly honest by the standards of the American military establishment. He said in essence that conducting such operations in a contested environment is extraordinarily challenging, and that the precondition for restoring normal transit through the strait would be a generally accepted ceasefire, not an American military victory. This is an admission of enormous strategic significance. The senior uniformed officer responsible for naval operations in that theater is telling Congress that the United States cannot force the strait open by military means, and that the restoration of commercial shipping depends on a negotiated political outcome. That is, stripped of diplomatic language, a statement that the military campaign has not achieved and cannot achieve its stated objective. And if that is the conclusion being reached in private by the American military command, it raises profound questions about what purpose is served by Trump's continued public insistence that everything has been destroyed and the mission accomplished. What most analysts still fail to understand is what this admission implies for the broader American strategic position and for the economic consequences that are only now beginning to manifest themselves in ways that will eventually be impossible for Western publics to ignore. The economic dimension of this confrontation is where the full weight of American strategic miscalculation will ultimately be felt most acutely, not in the casualty figures from aerial bombardment, not in the diplomatic communiques exchanged between capitals, but in the material conditions of ordinary life across the industrialized world. What this war has exposed with a brutality that no amount of financial market manipulation can permanently conceal is the extraordinary degree to which the global economy depends on a small number of commodities flowing through a single geographic choke point. Everyone understood, at least intellectually, that Persian Gulf oil mattered. Fewer people had genuinely internalized what a prolonged disruption of liquefied natural gas exports from Qatar would mean for European industrial production, for Asian electricity generation, for the entire network of petrochemical manufacturing that underpins modern consumer society. And almost nobody outside a narrow circle of specialists had any meaningful awareness of the role that Persian Gulf exports play in the global supply of helium, of sulfur, of urea, of the industrial inputs that do not make headlines until they are absent, and whose absence cascades through supply chains in ways that take months to fully materialize and years to repair. Qatar's helium production, before the damage it sustained in this conflict, represented approximately 44% of global supply. Helium is not a luxury commodity. It is essential to the manufacture of semiconductors, to magnetic resonance imaging equipment in hospitals, to fiber optic cable production, to aerospace and defense manufacturing. The world does not have a ready substitute for it, and the world does not have alternative sources standing by at sufficient scale to compensate for a 44% reduction in supply. The consequences of that reduction will work their way through industrial supply chains with the slow, grinding inevitability of a geological process. Months from now, perhaps a year from now, consumers in Europe and North America and East Asia will begin encountering shortages of products whose connection to a war in the Persian Gulf will not be immediately obvious to them. The semiconductor fabrication plant that cannot get helium cannot make chips. The hospital that cannot maintain its MRI equipment cannot perform the diagnostics that patients need. These are not speculative scenarios. They are the foreseeable consequences of decisions that were made by people who either did not understand the economic geography of the Persian Gulf or chose to disregard it in pursuit of political objectives that proved unattainable. The petrodollar dimension of this crisis deserves extended consideration because it connects the immediate military and economic disruptions to a structural transformation of the global financial order that has been building for years and has now been dramatically accelerated. The American financial system's extraordinary capacity to sustain chronic fiscal deficits, to finance government spending through the continuous issuance of Treasury securities, rests on a set of assumptions about global demand for dollar-denominated assets that this war has severely damaged. For decades, the recycling of petroleum export revenues through purchases of American Treasury bonds, the so-called petrodollar system, provided a structural foundation for American financial power that went far beyond what the underlying productive capacity of the American economy could have sustained on its own. The Gulf states deposited their oil revenues in American financial institutions and purchased American government debt, and in exchange they received American security guarantees and American military protection. That was the bargain. It was explicit, understood by all parties, and it worked, after a fashion, for a remarkably long time. What this war has done is to demonstrate in the most public and unambiguous way possible that the American side of that bargain can no longer be reliably delivered. The security guarantees turned out to be contingent on conditions that the American military could not meet. The protection turned out to be available only so long as the protected parties were willing to accept being used as launching pads for American military operations that exposed them to devastating retaliation. When the Gulf states declined that role, the American military found itself operationally constrained in ways that revealed the hollowness of the guarantees. And the Gulf states, being rational actors, drew the obvious conclusion: if the security guarantee is no longer reliable, the financial arrangement that was its counterpart is no longer obligatory. China and Russia were not slow to perceive this opening, and their offer of an alternative security architecture carries with it the implicit invitation to denominate petroleum trade in currencies other than the dollar, to route financial flows through institutions other than the American-dominated Western banking system, and to gradually dissolve the structural dependency on American financial markets that has constrained the sovereign choices of these states for half a century. The Treasury auction data that has been emerging in recent weeks is a leading indicator of where this process is heading. Japan has been reducing its holdings of American government debt. China has been selling treasuries in quantities that, while not yet catastrophic, represent a clear directional signal. Turkey reduced its treasury holdings from approximately $16 billion to under $2 billion in a period of months, a reduction driven in part by its own currency pressures, but reflecting also a broader reassessment of the wisdom of holding assets denominated in a currency whose global preeminence is increasingly in question. These are not coincidental or unrelated developments. They are the early manifestations of a structural shift in the global monetary order, and the war against Iran has accelerated that shift by demonstrating that American military power, the ultimate guarantor of dollar hegemony, has limits that are more constraining than the world had previously assumed. When Mike Pompeo stood at a podium recently and spoke of the enduring strength of the American Treasury market, he was describing a world that is dissolving in real time around the very podium from which he spoke. The irony would be almost comic if the consequences were not so serious. Against this backdrop of military constraint and financial erosion, the political dynamics within the United States itself are developing in ways that deserve careful attention. The Senate has passed a resolution invoking the War Powers Act, which would impose congressional constraints on the president's ability to continue military operations against Iran without explicit legislative authorization. The resolution now sits in the House, where Speaker Mike Johnson has declined to bring it to the floor, apparently because he calculates correctly that it would pass if it did. The significance of that calculation should not be underestimated. It means that a sufficient number of House Republicans are prepared to vote to constrain a president of their own party on a question of war and peace, and that the Speaker is suppressing that vote precisely because he knows what the outcome would be. This is a political system in which the executive is pursuing a military policy that lacks majority support in the legislature of its own partisan coalition, and the only thing preventing a formal legislative rebuke is the procedural control exercised by a speaker whose own motivations in this matter appear to be substantially shaped by his theological commitments to a particular strand of Christian Zionism that aligns his eschatological expectations with the security interests of the Israeli government. The role of Benjamin Netanyahu in this entire episode requires honest analysis because it has been obscured by layers of diplomatic courtesy that the actual facts do not warrant. Netanyahu is not a passive recipient of American military action taken on his behalf. He is an active architect of the strategic circumstances that produced this war, and his interests in the continuation of that war are substantially different from, and in important respects opposed to, the interests of the United States and the Gulf states that have been drawn into it. Israel has its own unfinished business in multiple theaters simultaneously. Gaza has not been pacified, despite months of operations that have produced civilian casualties on a scale that staggers the moral imagination. Hamas remains functional in its tunnel networks, a fact that generates visible frustration within the Israeli Defense Forces and among Netanyahu's domestic political critics, including figures like Naftali Bennett, who have been explicit in their assessment that the campaign has failed its stated objectives. Lebanon presents a separate and in some ways more intractable problem. The history of Israeli military engagement with Lebanon is a history of painful lessons learned at great cost and subsequently forgotten. The 1982 invasion, for which Ariel Sharon bore primary responsibility and which ended in a withdrawal shadowed by the massacre at Sabra and Shatila, a massacre that Israel still declines to acknowledge with the candor that historical honesty demands, established a pattern that the 2006 confrontation with Hezbollah confirmed and deepened. Each engagement has demonstrated that Israel's military power, formidable as it is, cannot produce the political outcomes that Israeli governments seek in Lebanon. And the current situation, in which Hezbollah is systematically targeting Israeli air defense infrastructure with drone attacks that Israel's Iron Dome batteries struggle to absorb sustainably, suggests that the pattern is repeating itself with variations that do not favor the Israeli side. Netanyahu understands all of this, and his response to it is to want the United States to resolve the Iranian dimension of the problem in a manner comprehensive enough to change the strategic equation across all of these theaters simultaneously. A destroyed or fundamentally transformed Iran would remove the principal source of material and political support for both Hezbollah and Hamas, would eliminate the strategic depth that gives those organizations their resilience, and would allow Israel to consolidate its position across Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Lebanon from a position of unchallenged regional dominance. This is a coherent strategic vision, but it is Netanyahu's strategic vision, not America's, and the cost of pursuing it would be borne overwhelmingly by the United States, by the Gulf states, and by the global economy, while the benefits would accrue primarily to Israel. The tension between Trump and Netanyahu that has been reported in recent weeks is almost certainly a reflection of Trump's growing awareness that the costs are higher, the military task more difficult, and the regional support more fragile than he was led to believe when the operation was presented to him as a manageable exercise in coercive diplomacy. The question of Iran's enriched uranium, which has been consuming enormous amounts of diplomatic bandwidth and media attention, needs to be understood in its proper context. Trump's demand that Iran surrender its enriched uranium stockpile, ideally by transferring it to American custody, is presented as a non-proliferation measure rooted in legitimate security concerns about Iranian nuclear weapons development. The presentation deserves scrutiny. Iran is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It has accepted International Atomic Energy Agency inspections over an extended period. The theological framework of Shia Islam, which has shaped Iranian strategic doctrine in ways that secular Western analysts consistently underestimate, contains a deep prohibition against the targeting of non-combatants, a prohibition that makes nuclear weapons not merely strategically imprudent but theologically impermissible for a government that derives its legitimacy from Islamic jurisprudence. This does not mean that Iranian intentions are beyond question, or that the enrichment program presents no legitimate concerns. It means that the American and Israeli presentation of Iran as a state imminently and inevitably seeking nuclear weapons capability is a narrative construction that serves political purposes rather than accurately describing observable Iranian behavior or stated Iranian doctrine. The enriched uranium issue functions, in the current diplomatic context, as what a conjurer would call misdirection. It is the shining object that draws the audience's attention to one hand, while the other hand performs the significant action. The significant action, the actual strategic objective shared by the United States and Israel, is the destruction of the Islamic Republic as a governing system and its replacement with something more amenable to the regional order that Washington and Tel Aviv prefer. Everything else, the nuclear program, the ballistic missiles, the proxy relationships with Hezbollah and Hamas, is framing that makes that objective presentable to a Western audience, conditioned to respond to the invocation of nuclear danger. Understanding this does not require attributing extraordinary cynicism to American or Israeli policymakers. It requires only recognizing that states pursue their interests through the narratives that best serve those interests, and that the narrative of Iranian nuclear menace has proven remarkably durable and useful for a remarkably long time. The emerging Eurasian security architecture that is developing in the background of this crisis represents perhaps its most consequential long-term dimension. The relationship between Russia and North Korea has been transformed by the exigencies of the Ukrainian conflict into something far more substantial than the distant, wary coexistence that characterized it for most of the post-Soviet period. North Korean forces have been deployed in significant numbers in support of Russian operations, and the reciprocal exchange of military technology and political recognition has given Pyongyang something it has sought for decades, namely great power endorsement of its status as a nuclear and missile power. The implications of that endorsement extend well beyond the Korean peninsula. North Korea now possesses intercontinental ballistic missile capability that its own engineers have demonstrated through tests analyzed in sufficient technical detail to confirm that warheads can reach Washington. The distance from Tehran to Washington is approximately 6,300 miles, a range well within the demonstrated capability of North Korean missiles. When Iranian officials speak of the ability to strike American cities in retaliation for continued American attacks, they are not necessarily making claims about Iranian missile capability alone. They are operating in a strategic environment in which the technology exists in friendly hands to make such threats credible. What we are witnessing, in sum, is not a discrete military confrontation between the United States and Iran that will be resolved by a negotiated agreement on uranium enrichment and a mutual declaration of success by both sides. We are witnessing a structural transformation of the international order, one in which American military primacy, financial hegemony, and alliance leadership are simultaneously under pressure in ways that reinforce and accelerate each other. The war against Iran did not cause this transformation, but it has served as a powerful accelerant, compressing into weeks and months a process of strategic realignment that might otherwise have unfolded over years. The Gulf states are reassessing their alignments. The global demand for dollar-denominated assets is weakening. The Eurasian powers are consolidating relationships that Washington spent decades trying to prevent. And the American military, for all its technological sophistication and enormous budgetary resources, has discovered that the geography of the Persian Gulf, the resilience of an adversary that has been preparing its defenses for 40 years, and the political limits imposed by regional partners unwilling to absorb the consequences of American military ambition have combined to produce a strategic impasse that no volume of presidential triumphalism can dissolve. The most honest assessment of where things stand is the one offered quietly by the military professionals who understand the operational realities. There is no military solution that the United States is willing to pay the actual cost of achieving, and the cost of the partial solution, already attempted, has been higher, in every dimension that matters, than anyone in Washington was prepared to acknowledge before the first bomb fell.